Hello, I'm delighted to be joined in this conversation by Libby Ralph. And Libby won't mind me saying that I think Libby's main interest is a passion for conservation, ecology and biodiversity, which gets us into a different topic in the conversation compared to the conversations we've had previously. Libby's been a resident of Farnham since 1988. Her main interest being landscape ecology, and we'll hear more about that as we go through this conversation. She's a trustee of the Friends of Farnham Park, one of our great green spaces and historic green spaces. She's chair of the Farnham Rivers Group. I'm looking at my notes here, Libby, because you're involved in so many things. And the Farnham Rivers Group is concerned with the health of the River Wey. And you also act as a volunteer and have had plenty of volunteer involvement with various conservation organisations, RSPB, Surrey Wildlife Trust, and will no doubt cover others. But your background, I think, in terms of your professional career was as an IT specialist, spending 30 years in IT, and we'll no doubt get to that a little bit later as well. But you gave that up. You did a degree in conservation and wildlife management. So with that, as I hope I've done justice to a varied CV that you have, it struck me that we have many ways we could get into our conversation. But I think perhaps the best way of getting into it is to start with the Farnham Biodiversity Group, which is a relatively recent new organisation set up in Farnham in 2019. So perhaps we can start with that, Libby, and what brought the Farnham Biodiversity Group into being.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so it really started with several of us who independently and together had worked with the town council over the few years in connection with the neighbourhood plan, and particularly in relation to concerns about biodiversity and wildlife in Farnham. Noel Moss and Martin Angel in particular for the Bourne Conservation Group worked a lot with Carol Coburn, Farnham Town Council. I got involved with Carol, particularly looking at aspects of Farnham Old Park and the importance of that to Farnham, because that's the corner of Farnham where I live. And another key player is Steve Langham, who is the chairman of the Surrey and Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, and he knows a lot about sort of Caesar's Camp and the north side of Farnham. Got to the stage where there's really, given the structure of what you're supposed to have in a neighbourhood plan, we'd reached the limits of where we could sort of protect biodiversity aspects and wildlife in that forum. We've put various things in the neighbourhood plan and also more recently into the Farnham design statement, recognising.
Can I just interrupt you there on the neighbourhood plan, because people looking at this may not know this bit of information, but part of the neighbourhood plan, which if you remember we had a referendum about, but part of it was about what measures could go into that neighbourhood plan to improve diversity, to improve conservation, to improve, in the sense, environment and ecology. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, and the neighbourhood plan and the design statement are very much about the character of the town. And yeah, we recognise in both of those that Farnham is a very green place. And it does support a lot of biodiversity, partly because we live at the junction of so many different sort of geological features and different types of habitat, green spaces, woods and the heathlands, particularly to the south and north. So there's a lot of diversity, and it is very important to the town. But as a vehicle, the neighbourhood plan has to cover a lot of aspects, and so it can't go into all of them in huge amounts of detail, and we did feel there was something missing. The other thing that was sort of brought us to this was that in the early 2000s, actually councils at the borough level were highly encouraged to produce a biodiversity action plan of their own. But for the various reasons, probably greatly connected with their problems over the local plan. Waverley never did this, and we felt this was a gap in our armoury. And if we could start driving something from at least the Farnham level, we thought it was important then that it was putting up a flag for Farnham, saying this is important to us, and it will feed gradually into Waverley and the whole of the area.
I mean, as I've read a little bit about this, I mean, not too much, but it struck me that this goes back even further. You mentioned 2000, but the government had a biodiversity action plan going back to 1994, didn't it? And the idea then was to encourage local councils, local authorities to have their own. You know, if it was macro, not global, but national, they wanted micro action plans. So it seems a bit disappointing to learn that between 1994, it's taken, well, until 2019, in a sense, we didn't have this initiative underway.
Yeah, I mean, it is a shame. And as I say, I think a lot of it is due to the complications of Waverley. And as you know, that the problems they've had in terms of getting an agreed local plan and so on. I think also it's a recognition that the councils around us that did produce plans sort of during the late 90s and 2000s, like Rushmore and Hart, they're actually quite constrained in what they can do. They can really only focus on the green spaces and so on that they control. So they can talk about how they're protecting those for biodiversity. But we felt by looking at this as a Farnham context and bringing together a partnership to work together on it, that actually we wanted to try and look at all the aspects of biodiversity. It's not just land that's owned or managed by the councils. It's actually saying, well, there's all sorts of stakeholders, and there's all sorts of things that contribute to the biodiversity of this area in the town.
I was interested to see that I think it's 100 public spaces, green spaces in Farnham. That was amazing to think that, well, there's 100. But of course, that then leads to this trying to embrace the many gardens, the private spaces, because you can't just limit improving biodiversity to those 100 spaces that are
well,
in
yeah,
the public
absolutely.
realm.
I mean, that's 100 spaces include everything from Farnham Park, which is managed in quite a lot of the area for wildlife and biodiversity, and as a local nature reserve, through the more formal gardens that we've got. But obviously, we've got diversity in the plants and so on that will help support some species there, down to green spaces that are just squares of grass. But if you look at Farnham as a whole, we calculated roughly it's probably between a third and a quarter of the area of Farnham is private spaces, and so it's helped to raise the awareness that, well, there's a big chunk that each of us could perhaps do a little bit about.
We'll come to that, I think, in a moment, and how's it going. But you refer back to 2000. It's easy for us to forget to remember that from 2000 onwards, from 1998 perhaps onwards, we've been in a difficult economic environment. I'm tempted to say, well, when aren't we in a difficult economic environment? But how would you answer the feeling that says, well, biodiversity, it's a nice to have? I mean, it hasn't happened since 1994 in the way that we would have wished, because it's a nice to have. It can't be afforded. What would be your response to that particular viewpoint?
I think we are beginning to understand much more broadly what, you know, the experts have always known, that it's not a nice to have. It's actually so essential to the way that we live and operate as human beings. I mean, if you look at all the natural resources, lots of medicines and so on come from plants. A lot of processes that we rely on, like sort of seed spreading and so on, is through animals. The microbes in the soil, all the way through. Actually, biodiversity is what keeps us alive. So it's a very, very important feature.
We've got a
And
granddaughter. We've got a granddaughter who's called Bee. Well, she's known as Bee, and we thought it would be good to buy her some bee sort of emblem stuff. A few years ago, it didn't exist. Now there's bees everywhere, and of course, bees is at the heart of what we're losing and what's a threat to us as well, isn't it?
well, absolutely. Pollinators is a big thing. We also have to recognise, all the role of all the other insect species in particular that are not necessarily pollinators, but they might be eating things that are rotting down in the soil. And also they're the bottom of the food chain for a lot of the other animals and birds. So they're very, very important.
You've been interested in this field for a long while. As I said, I'll come to that a little bit later, but one gets the feeling, whether it's that program I referred to last night, Earthshot, but generally speaking, this seems to be an idea where the momentum is developing very fast. Often climate change is the headline of everything. And of course, that's key to the loss of biodiversity. Do you think that the next few years will see an acceleration of interest? The conversation we're having is an aspect of focusing on
yes,
something rather than the built environment.
I certainly hope so. I think, the whole gamut of biodiversity is very much linked to climate change. And also there's a growing realization among the wider population as to how much we have lost in this country over the last 30, 40, 50 years. People beginning to realize that things that they thought were very common in the gardens and so on, such as sparrows or starlings and so on, you see a lot less often, and it's got to the stage where it's noticeable to anybody, even if you're not particularly interested in the subject. So I think it is triggering a lot of interest.
Do you find that personally, the classic dinner conversation, whatever it is, when you're asked, well, what are you interested in? And you say biodiversity or landscape ecology. I can imagine a few years ago, and I'm being controversial here purposely, it's not my personal view, would sort of, oh dear, somebody interested in biodiversity and ecology. I'm more interested in motorbikes or cars. Has that changed? Generally speaking,
I think it's changing.
Supportive.
I think you still wouldn't say I'm interested in those words. You probably have to be a bit more down to earth and talk about wildlife and so on. But
Well, let me move it on a little bit. I mean, I think one of the things from the Farnham Biodiversity Group is to produce an action plan in the way that we've touched on, that was suggested by government some time ago. Farnham, as you say, hasn't had one of those. How do you start to go about that? It's, I think, about what's the start point?
Well, the start point is, I suppose, twofold. Trying to, first of all, put a marker in the ground that says the town is interested in this topic. And one of the things that we've worked on over the last year is with the town council drafting a biodiversity policy for them, which council have now recently adopted. And so that puts biodiversity at the heart of town policy and shows that they think it's important. The second thing in terms of trying to produce a plan is taking stock of what we have. And as I say, one of the aspects of Farnham that makes that difficult is we actually have a lot of very different things through different types of habitats surrounding the town, heaths and green spaces, and also the importance of the river. So what we've tried to do is sort of look at, we've had the advantage that at least if Farnham is late to the table, we can look what other people have done. And we've followed a very good model, one of which was developed through the London Borough of Richmond. And so again, an urban environment, but to take really sort of broad stock of what we've got and then start drilling down into areas that we can start working on and gradually build up the picture. So one of the things we've done over the last year or so is focus down on a few things that we think are quite iconic to Farnham. So that includes the swifts that you hear over Castle Street and up and down West Street in the summer, stag beetles that we find a lot around sort of the woodland edges and Farnham Park, things like hedgehogs that everybody is keen on if they see them, and things like that. Take stock of where they are in Farnham, look at hotspots, and then see what we can do to try and improve the habitat and improve the opportunities for those species, so expanding out from those hotspots.
One of the features of the newly formed 2019, I think, Farnham Biodiversity Group was its focus on partnership. And partnership can often be a noble objective, but very difficult to deliver. Am I right in thinking not only have you got good involvement with Farnham Town Council and our Borough Council in Waverley, but more than 12 other organisations embracing involvement with this new group? Is that right?
I think, yeah, I think actually we're up to 19 or 20 in total, which is wonderful. It can be difficult to operate in partnership, and different partners have different levels of involvement. But I think one of the great advantages is that the different types of organisations have different roles in that partnership. I mean, obviously we want the town and the borough to show leadership in this topic. We've also got organisations like the Surrey Wildlife Trust and the Environment Agency, who act as advisors to the partnership very much. We've got people like the Bourne Conservation Group and the Tice's Meadow Bird Group, who've got sort of key conservation interests of their own, and they're keen to collaborate and share ideas and so on. And then we've got organisations like the Farnham Society and like the Rotary Club at Farnham, who are perhaps more of a membership organisation and not necessarily linked closely to this type of topic. But there's an opportunity then to raise awareness through that membership. Absolutely,
and I hope in some small way our chat this afternoon or today can help raise that awareness, because I'm struck by the use of the word conservation and interest in conservation, both in the natural world, but obviously more traditionally the Farnham Society in the built environment and heritage. But they need to both come together to create the environment we all enjoy and we all enjoy living in.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that we've tried to capture in the design statement, that the character of Farnham embraces both of those things very much.
You refer to hedgehogs and stag beetles. How do you reach out to the schools and to the youngsters in our demographic, where one senses this is a particularly appropriate current profile of topic?
I mean, it's quite challenging just because of bandwidth. Obviously, it's very difficult to get engaged with some of these. What we have done is, if you talk about things like stag beetles, we've engaged with one of the junior schools in Upper Hale. They do various sort of nature walks and so on into the parks, and so stag beetles is one of the things that we've given them information about and that they can look for. We've also engaged with a number of representatives within schools like St Peter's and also Rowledge, where they're trying to build forest school activities into the curriculum. And they come to us advice. South Farnham came to us with advice on what they could do around their pond to increase biodiversity and things like that. So in small ways we're trying to do what we can. The other thing that actually later this week, I bumped into somebody quite by chance in the park, and they were just stopped to see what the volunteers were doing, and it turned out to be somebody who worked for the Wildlife Aid Foundation in Leatherhead, and they're starting a new campaign that they call IDOT, which is I Do One Thing. And they're trying to get this out into schools in Surrey to say, everybody can do one thing towards helping biodiversity, helping wildlife. So one of the advantages of creating a partnership network is that we engage with other organisations who help us do these things that we don't necessarily have the capacity to do.
That's an interesting example. I mean, I like that, IDOT, but it sort of speaks to this developing momentum. I mean, if you go back 10 years or 15 years, or go back to when you decided to get involved 2010 and beyond on a more full-time basis, those sorts of initiatives wouldn't have been around, would they? That's an example of accelerating interest and momentum on this topic.
Absolutely, and also I think the recognition that we can all take small steps. There's, you know, all of us sometimes can be very resistant to change, and they say, oh, we can't, you know, well, I can't do that, that's all too much, it's all too difficult. But if you start identifying the small steps, then more people can come on board and say, oh, well, yes, well, I can do that one. And it does, you know, hopefully create a momentum of its own.
You talk about small steps. You mentioned Tice's Meadow. Of course, Tice's Meadow, well publicised over the last 6 months or so, with the threat to its continuation. And without going into that, I was interested to see that the owners, going back in time, Hanson, actually produced their own biodiversity action plan, didn't they, for that space? What happened to that? Did that just sort of get sidelined, or how do you reconcile that at one point with the pressure and need for economic growth and building development?
Well, yeah, there is always a concept, you know, conflict for an individual landowner, which I think, you know, is what happens with Tice's Meadow, that they want to do the right thing, but ultimately they're going to be answerable to their shareholders for the bottom line. But I think more generally in this area, I think that's, you know, the whole pressure of development is something that, you know, we're going to continue to be very conscious of, and we do have to push back. I mean, I think one of the difficulties of counties and councils being given development targets is that it's in terms of numbers. And we get all these houses built, you know, many of them might be for people who commute elsewhere. We need to get better about matching development to what we need locally. What sort of developments do we need for the people who actually work in Farnham to live in, and focus down on what's needed at a local area.
Don't you think our generation, on our watch, if I can put it like that, we have a responsibility, the balance between the needs of development and house building, to just pick that example, against maintaining a pleasant environment with its ecology, with its biodiversity, becomes a much more tricky balance as growth develops. Isn't it a losing battle?
I don't think it has to be. I think, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Over 30, 40 years, you know, it probably goes back to our parents' generation and coming out of, you know, the two wars when everything was very hard, and therefore growth and making life easier was probably the main focus. I think we have a much better understanding as to what we can do in balance these days. You know, it doesn't have to be a conflict. There are things that we can do that we can still have a good life, but make it easier on biodiversity and on the planet in general.
And our generation has to, in a way, pass on to the coming generations what we've enjoyed, rather than it being lost. Well, let me move into a different area before leaving the conservation group, because I was interested to see that you've actually set up a community interest company to support the activity. Why was that decision taken? You know, it's a partnership, it's a group, it could be a trust, but you've taken the step of setting up a community interest company. What lies behind that?
It's a difficult one, yes. I mean, we had a lot of discussion about what we were and what we ought to be and so on, whether we were a charity or just a group and so on. And I think there's probably not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It's down to the individual groups. The reason that we did it was that we felt it was important, because we were working in partnership and we were working closely with the councils, that it had to be a formal group, so that it was clear what we were trying to do and what the objectives were, but also, you know, the limits of what we can or couldn't do. And becoming a community interest company rather than charity was in a sense part of that, in that it's you know, a limited liability, and we can constrain what we are and we are responsible for. So yeah, we are giving, if you like, informal advice sometimes to the council, but the fact that it's a community interest company recognises that is informal, and it's not something that if it all went wrong because they took our advice, they could sue us and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Is there a funding implication? I mean, how do you fund this activity?
I mean, most of the work is obviously us being voluntary. We did have an initial grant from the town council in terms of setting up administratively, and to date, actually, through the partnership, we've been able to be fairly self-funding through donations of time and effort and materials and so on. If we identify a particular community project, then we would be looking to the various grant schemes and so on available to fund those sorts of projects.
I've mentioned at various points I might come to your personal development and interest in this, so perhaps I could do that now and ask you what got you interested in this whole area. I don't just mean in, I think it was 2010 you chose to do a degree in conservation and wildlife management, but show me somebody at 7 with an interest, and it can often either disappear or stay with them for the rest of their life. What got you interested in this?
Well, yes, you could say that the 30 years I spent in an office was probably the mistake rather than a change of direction. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned our generation, wanting to hand on what we've enjoyed, and I grew up in, you know, a small village environment in the Midlands, and was always outside in the countryside. Yeah, I wasn't particularly a sort of collector interested in any individual species, birds or butterflies or whatever, but just enjoyed the natural outdoors. And I suppose gradually over time, I became conscious of what I was missing out on working, you know, in a more office environment, but also how people in general become less connected to those sort of things. I mean, I did spend some time considering whether I sort of moved out earlier and made a career change into this sort of environment. In the end, circumstances meant that by the time I got round to it, I was actually able to, I mean, I was fortunate to be able to come out, do what I wanted and do it on a voluntary basis, rather than looking for a second career. And that's allowed me to get involved in sort of a number of different things rather than have to focus in one area.
I guess it's the classic, you know, mid-career or mid-term or later career. You do something you want to do rather than something you feel that you've had to be
yeah,
following.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You've talked about start point. I was interested to read that I think at the UK level, 15% of our national species, if I can put it like that, or natural species, are threatened, with 50% in decline, which is the story since the early 90s. I walked the dog round the paths of the Bourne and Farnham Park and along the River Way. It looks a pretty lush and green and very happy green environment. Therefore, this sort of sits in a very interesting way. How badly off are we, if you know, within the Farnham area? And I know we can't draw a boundary and say, well, it's all right in this bit and not in that bit, but does that national picture reflect what's going on in and around Farnham?
I think it's very hard to to measure it at a very local level. I think, as I say, we have some advantages because we have the biodiversity around us, and a lot of good work has already gone on. So if you look at, for example, places like the RSPB at Farnham Heath, there's a huge amount of effort already been put into habitat restoration, which we know has generated a return of a lot of different species, and the same sort of the heaths at Caesar's Camp. In terms of the general environment, so I think we're fortunate in town that there's a lot of greenery about. What we need to be aware of is not everything that is green is necessarily biodiverse. You know, as humans, we have put a great deal of sort of fertilizer into, you know, grass and things like that, which has reduced the biodiversity of some of our green spaces, and we need to take some of that out. We also have a lot of things in our gardens, some of which add to the season, and we get more pollinators because we're extending the season through different flowering periods and so on. But some of the things, if you look at, for example, things like rhododendron and laurel and so on that we use for our hedges, they may be green and they may form a purpose, but because they're not native to this country, they don't necessarily support as many species as, say, a hawthorn hedge would. So we have to look at slightly beyond the green and to understand what that green is to a certain extent.
So what are the key short-term objectives for either the Biodiversity Action Plan or in particular the Farnham Biodiversity Group? What would you identify as the 3 short-term objectives for the next 5 years? Tricky question, I realise, but I'd just be interested in your view.
We've done sort of the groundwork. So as I say, we have established the biodiversity policy with the town, and we've produced a first draft of our overall plan. Certainly over the next 6 months or a year, we want to use the projects on the species that I've identified to help generate interest and to show that we can make a difference in some smaller areas. So we did a lot of work this summer, particularly through work by a guy called Pete Bigford, who's one of our key supporters, surveying where all the swifts nest in the town. We want to build on that. We're going to work with the Titus Meadow Bird Group to get bird boxes out to people who are interested and offer more and more nesting sites in those key areas for swifts. And that sort of action helps to create interest and public momentum. And then sort of extending out over the next sort of 3 or 4 years, we'd then build on that with other areas of focus. You mentioned early on that I've been part of the Rivers Group and connected to that quite a lot. Getting more people in Farnham to be interested in our river and valuing it as an asset is something that we will be looking at. It's a very important and valuable river, and the more people appreciate that, then the more we can keep it hopefully in good condition. And the other focus area gradually is that Waverley is now in a position at last to be able to do something more about their biodiversity plans. We want to be working closely with them and obviously collaborating on what that means for Farnham.
What do you think are the things that worry you and your colleagues on this initiative? What are the key challenges as you see it?
I think, although you've said that you've identified things are changing, I think we're starting from a low base in terms of how many people think, this is high up on their agenda. And I think the key challenge is getting up the agenda for more people and making threats to biodiversity almost as big a topic to moan about as the traffic in Farnham and things like that.
So if you could change three things or wish for three things to make this work move faster, what would they be?
Well, I guess that would be quite good as the first one, as I say, getting people to think it's as important as the traffic. The second one would be to get more and more people engaged in doing a little bit, as I mentioned, the I Do One Thing, the IDOC campaign, that kind of approach. If everybody did a little bit in their garden or became more aware of something that could be done in the green spaces, then we start to build that momentum. And I think the third, and probably one of the biggest challenge, is raising the importance of biodiversity in our whole planning and development system. The new environment bill, when it hopefully becomes enacted at the end of this year or early next year, does put an onus much more on councils to take it into account. We have to all, I think, work with our councils to make sure that that's done in a way that actually works, as opposed to ticking the boxes. And that's going to be a big challenge as everybody learns about the ways in which measurement of biodiversity and so on has to be applied.
Perhaps I'll end on this, that the Farnham Society has a vision of trying to protect the built environment heritage. I think it goes wider than that, to the history of people and their stories which have helped create that. And of course, what this brings on to the agenda on an equal basis is conservation of our natural environment. What can other organisations do more than just being part of the partnership? What would you like to see them do to support this aspect of conservation, to protect the town for future generations, as we've discussed briefly?
Yeah, I think what you've just said is a very important aspect. Recognise that the greenness and the biodiversity of Farnham is as an important aspect as the buildings. And to look at their own space and their own actions and see how they impact. And that helps communicate to our leaders and our politicians and so on that the people of Farnham think this is important.
Well, I suppose, as we've discussed, it's not about one big major initiative. The real impact comes from that cliche, let 1,000 small individual initiatives add up to something that does in itself make a difference.
Let's hope so.
Libby, thank you very much indeed for your time, and good luck with the Farnham Biodiversity Group and the Farnham Biodiversity Action Plan and everything else you do. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.